Welcome to this first session of the 2022 Global Forest Summit in Brussels and online. We will discuss now this wonderful topic from New York to Glasgow. How do we keep forests on top of the global agenda by 2030, until 2030? That's very important to remember that New York was the city that hosted the adoption of the platform and declaration on forest in 2014. And that Glasgow was the city hosting UNFCCC COP 26 in 2021, coming out, resulting in this Glasgow Leaders Declaration on forest and landscape. We are having a wonderful panel today, and I'm happy to say to everyone listening from all across the globe that you will be able to ask questions to our panelists and distinguished guests. You just need to use the QR code that is appearing on your screen, scan it, and it's gonna put you into a chat mode that you will be able to use, and I'm gonna make sure we use your questions and address them to our speakers. The first of which is Dr. Agnès Kalibata. I'm very pleased to host Agnès, President of AGRA and former UN Secretary General and Special Envoy for the 2021 Food System Summit. You've been also Minister for Agriculture in Rwanda. Agnès, thank you very much for being the keynote speaker of this first session. I'd like to give you the floor so that you can highlight of the importance of striking a right balance, a sustainable balance of land use between agriculture and forests.
Thank you so much. Thank you for welcoming me and for having me as part of this summit. Let me take this opportunity also to recognize all the distinguished guests and speakers that will be part of this summit and our online and physical audience that is part of this summit. Coming out of the Food System Summit last year, we have a number of things that I really wanted to bring out for this particular audience. First of all, there was a recognition that food systems touch every SDG of the 17 SDGs. And if we are going to transform the SDGs, that we need the food system to work, which is the second factor actually, that our food systems must transform to be able to achieve all 17 SDGs. And the last one that I want to pull out is that the survival of our planet, whether it is us as a people, whether it is the planet itself, and the prosperity of both people and planet depend on how we transform and how successful we'll be at transforming our food system, recognizing that 30% of global emissions today come from food-related investments and food-related challenges. But let me take the conversation back to the Global Forest Summit this morning and what we are learning. On Monday this week, I'm in Nairobi. On Monday was International Day of the Forest, as you all know. And one person, Kala, who is actually the head of FAO here, wrote in the Business Diary, and I'm going to quote, just to bring to you the importance of what she was trying to say here. In silence, they clean our air, provide us with clean air, give us our fruits, medicine, recreation, wood and fuel. A rotting log will, in silence, fertilize the next tree. In terms of climate change, which we are living in today, they cool our overheating globe and act as carbon sinks for all these emissions, the greenhouse emissions that are happening. So in a nutshell, forests are a nature-based solution for correcting many of the environmental challenges that we live in today. Restoration of biodiversity, given the extinction crisis that is in our midst, and a source of health and diets for us and for our planet. We know that forests contribute significantly to countries' GDPs. For example, in DRC, they contribute up to 6% of the GDP, but our forests are at threat. In Africa alone, 17%, which contributes 17% of the world's forests, is actually losing forests at a very, very high rate. And we know that globally, we have a degradation coming from forests the size of the South American continent. So to the point that Kala was making, the biggest call we can make today has to be about protecting and restoring our forests. In Africa, 65% of our forests, of productive land in agriculture is degraded. And this started out as forest land. Desertification is now affecting 45% of the continent's land. These are all challenges of related to forests and deforestation and degradation. So there are a number of things that we need to be doing, and I want to go back to that. I first of all want to recognize the opportunity of restoration and land management that would come from restoring forests, a 1.4 trillion opportunity if we only managed to rehabilitate some of the forests that we've already lost. So it's very important that we stop, from an agricultural sector perspective, producing producing food at the expense of the environment. The case has just been made around what the environment is providing for us, especially in these times of climate change. 30% of our produced food here in Africa every year comes from new land. Some of that new land is actually forests. I don't want to go into the details of energy and infrastructure, but we know that energy and infrastructure are costing us a lot in terms of forests. And of course, conflict, as you will see, conflict is another thing that is bearing badly on food, on energy and shelter, and that impacts our forests. So what must we do as we go forward? We must protect our existing forests and the opportunities there. It takes 2 to 4 generations for some of our trees to mature, to get to a mature tree, and yet we cut them down in a second. So we need to protect our forests and our trees. We need to respect the Paris Agreement that added ecosystem restoration to the 2015 Paris Agreement to ensure that we prioritize it. And we need to make sure that over the 720 million hectares of land, equivalent to the size of Australia here in Africa, that can be restored, actually needs to be restored. We need to make sure that the Great Green Wall that has been put in place under the African Union leadership actually does get the opportunity to be that green wall that can protect the continent from further desertification. We have an opportunity through the AFR 100, which a partnership that we have also signed to as AGRA, to ensure that it is used to support smallholder farmers to restore their degraded land. But most of all, we need to recognize that we need to be talking to each other. I don't want to go into the different opportunities that are sitting in our midst. I just want to call us out to and how these work very well when we engage them. Look at the Bonn challenge of 2021, where Iucn and the German government led on committing to restoration, and how much was done after that. Ethiopia restored 15 million hectares. The government of Sudan restored 14 million hectares. Cameroon restored 12 million hectares. And so on, I could go on and on. If we don't put these efforts in place and ensure that smallholder farmers overcome the challenge of having access to the inputs they need to do restoration, this challenge will not go away. If we don't recognize that restoration is local and has to be done in local context, recognizing that deforestation and restoration challenges are actually local, and empower communities to be able to overcome them, we will have challenges. Restoration and protection cannot be done by mandates alone. It has to be done through education. It has to be done by bringing people along, and it cannot be achieved through ideology. We have to understand the local context and challenges that people work with, and we have to help them come out of these challenges. So smallholder farmers in Africa need to produce and have good productivity. And if they don't, they use the land, which is the only resource that they have next to them. We need to talk to each other as ministers of agriculture and ministers of environment. And it's ridiculous that ministers of agriculture or even food systems summit would be calling to be included on an agenda of a COP that is trying to deal with challenges of climate change. So the need to have conversations and build trust and build the education needed to ensure that communities come through is probably the most important place for us to start. We, after all, now all understand that conserving our environment is probably the most important part of survival. We've been using food systems and the environment to drive down the cost of food for the longest time to ensure that we get the cost of food to be as affordable as possible. But now the time has come for us to understand that our survival depends on how well we protect our environment. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity. Restoring forests is part of feeding mankind, is part of coming through on food, and I wish you good deliberations.
Leadership in making sure that this 2021 Food System Summit took place in good conditions despite the pandemic, and sharing with us the results of this very important diplomatic event that feeds our reflection about forests. I would like to highlight 4 different points that you made while we welcome in our discussion room the speakers of the first panel today. You've clearly highlighted how important the holistic approach of the SDGs is, and how interconnected it was with peace. Sustainability and peace cannot be separated from one another, and this is even more relevant in the context of this Ukraine situation that we need to take into account in our reflection, especially in today's Brussels context. You've also highlighted the importance when we look at projects, amazing projects like the Great Green Wall, to get from pledges to the ground, and making sure that funding flows to those who need it to make it happen. And to talk to each other. And to talk to each other is exactly what we're going to do right now in the very spirit of this Global Forest Summit, a multi-stakeholder platform that brings together leaders from very different sectors. I'm happy to host in the panel in the alphabetical order Nick Bridge, UK Foreign Secretary Special Envoy for Climate Change, who is of course going to talk to us about the COP26 results. I'm also happy to host Dr. Musonda Mamba, Doctor of the UN Development Programme's Rome Center for Sustainable Development, and also former chair of the GPFLR, the Global Partnership for Forest and Landscape Restoration. Very welcome, Musonda. And I'm also signaling that you're part of an international advisory board. We are very proud to work with you across the year to make sure of the success of this Global Forest Summit. I'm also very pleased to welcome Virginijus Sinkevicius, the European Commissioner for the Environment. I would like particularly to welcome him, as this day is very hectic in Brussels due to the situation in Ukraine and the European Council. So I'm very grateful for you, Virginijus, to be with us today. Let me also involve in the discussion Dr. Jonathan Wetzel, Senior Partner at McKinsey and Director of the McKinsey Global Institute. He's talking to us from China, I guess Shanghai. Welcome, Jonathan, to this discussion. And last but not least, Chris Zink, Managing Director for Natural Capital Solutions Fund at Conservation International, one of the most involved NGO in the realm of nature conservation, and in particular for forests. Welcome to all of you. We will discuss about this title I've just outlined, From New York to Glasgow, Keeping Forest on Top of the Agenda until 2030. I should have said the financial agenda until 2030, because it's now about the way we make sure money feeds the different projects, programs, actions that have been outlined and taken at Glasgow and so on. And my first question would go to Commissioner Sinkevicius, to move, I would say, from 2021 to 2022, not only because, Virginijus, you've been part of the closing panel of the 2021 Global Forest Summit, and I thank you for having made the bridge to Brussels today, but because 2021 was kind of expected to be the super year for nature, expected to host at the same time the 3 Rio Conventions COPs. Actually, only the UNFCCC COP 26 met in Glasgow. The UNCCD COP was postponed. The UNCBD COP was transformed into a digital and partial event. The three Rio conventions could not make the nexus we expected around forest, so 2021 turned out to be a bit deceptive. And I'd like whether you shared this deception or you still keep optimistic, especially in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is it going to be more deceptive for the global sustainability agenda and especially for forests?
Right. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. And of course, thank you very much for having me. You're absolutely right saying that we are living extremely difficult times, which do upset the international agenda. But I have to say, I don't want to share that pessimistic view for forests. The Glasgow COP was quite powerful, and we now see a much greater understanding around the world of the multitasking role that forests play. It was disappointing not to find a specific reference to nature-based solutions in the final text, but all through the conference, world leaders stressed the importance of nature-based solutions and made pledges to support a scaling up of their implementation. The outcome also recognizes the important role of nature and stresses the urgent need for protecting and restoring ecosystems to keep the 1.5 degrees target within reach. So many positive and quite encouraging signals. Now, the war in Ukraine is definitely in all our minds at the moment, but that doesn't change also the urgency to address deforestation and forest degradation. And there are no trade-offs here, and one crisis doesn't drive out another. So climate change and biodiversity loss is the most obvious way our existential crisis. The best scientists in the world constantly remind us of it and underline the need for urgent action. And the latest, the sixth assessment report released by the IPCC last month is more than worrying. It plainly states that ecosystem integrity is now threatened by the positive feedback between direct human impacts and climate change. And when they talk about direct human impact, they mean everything that concerns us today, such as land use change, pollution, overexploitation, fragmentation, destruction, and so on. So the report refers also very clearly to the Amazon as one particularly worrying example, explaining that a large-scale ecological transformation is to be expected with a shift from a closed, wet forest into drier vegetation with less biomass, grassland instead of rainforest. So if we allow the current situation to continue, the interaction between climate change, deforestation, and forest fires would lead to a reduction of the forested area of more than 60%. So the recent Nature study on the Amazon is even more radical and concludes that deforestation and climate change may already have pushed the Amazon close to a critical threshold of rainforest dieback. So in short, the threshold is approaching. And if we reach that threshold, there is no turning back. And that's what a tipping point really means. So if you ask me, are the alarm bells ringing? Absolutely, yes. Are they ringing loud enough? I'm not so sure, but that's one of the reasons that we are here. Coming back to your question, let's not forget that many encouraging things did happen in 2021. We saw a level of international commitment that was quite unprecedented. The Iucn World Congress took up the issue and adopted a remarkable resolution on the Amazon rainforest. And as I said, we had the extraordinary and frankly unexpected political commitment from the world leaders at COP26 to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. Awareness is definitely there, commitments too, but we now need action. And this is why the Commission has come with a proposal for new regulation on deforestation. The EU contributes to biodiversity loss and to greenhouse gas emissions through its consumption. So we know it and we want to take responsibility for it. And we therefore need to stop producing on deforested land or importing commodities grown on deforested land. And we have taken an extremely ambitious and unprecedented approach, but it's the only one up to the challenge.
We will discuss precisely this detailed approach and bills that you've been introduced to the Parliament and the Council later on, but keeping on the track of assessing the today's stakes, I'd like to turn to Musonda Mumba. I remind who is the director of the Rome, UNDP's Rome Center for Sustainable Development. We often, too often, I would say, point out deforestation as a key problem. According to FAO, indeed, it's about 10 million hectares per year lost since between 2015 and 2020. But deforestation is not the only one forest policy problem we need to address. And that's why, as the former chair of GPFLR, I would like you to explain to us what is at stake if we have a broader approach to forest than deforestation. Musonda.
No, thank you very much, Thomas. I'm really, really honored to be a part of this amazing panel. I just want to pick up very quickly on where our Commissioner Sienkiewicz actually ended on the very fact that we are living in the age of humans, the Anthropocene. And going back to your question, I think we have come a long way, but also to think that as we've entered, coming all the way from Glasgow, I don't even want to go back as far as New York. I just want to pick up the baton from Glasgow. A lot of gains were made there, but also we have to realize as we entered 2022, we entered really the year of multilateralism. This is when, Stockholm at 50, that important conference that happened in 1972, on the heels of the Club of Rome Limits to Growth, that really showed that us as humans have done something to our planet. Now, here we are in 2022, 2.5 years plus into the pandemic, where the pandemic has actually shown us the interconnected nature of how we exist on this planet. And really in light to the conversation that we're having around forests, and particularly that this is a Global Forest Summit, we also have to bear in mind that this is the year that also where the 3 Rio Conventions turn 30. So Rio plus 30. So, the CCC, obviously that had COP26 last year and is having COP27 in Africa at the end of the year. And then the Land Convention, UNCCD, is having its COP in Côte d'Ivoire later on in May. And then obviously later on with the biodiversity framework, how is it that we're coming to 50 years of environmental governance and all the curves seem to be going down? Biodiversity loss, deforestation, land use management and mismanagement, unsustainable consumption and production, and all things complex around how we deal with nature, even if we've had really nature present in a lot of the multilateral conversation. I want to flag that I think the opportunity arises now. And even when we've seen the world spiral into a very complex situation, and the commissioner made reference to the situation that we're having, and also Dr. Kalibata, in relation to the conflict. I want to also say that even though, I'll give a classic example because I spend most of my time in Nairobi, even with the complexity of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, we've seen how the spiraling of fossil fuels and gases have now shifted in the use of biofuel on the African continent, because a lot of people cannot afford the spiraling costs of these fossil products, and perhaps an opportunity for the world. We've been discussing through multilateral processes around renewable energy, around innovative and use of new advanced technologies, around how we use the systems in a more systems lens, and particularly with what the GPFLR stands for. And when I was chair, how I advocated for forest landscape restoration. We need to look at the holistic nature of these landscapes. And I think the window of opportunity has opened. We've seen how most of the EU now is really trying to transition fairly quickly to renewable energies and also really make sure that there's no pressure on their ecosystems. Similarly, a lot of the global south needs to be supported in really transitioning to this, because there will be implications on forest ecosystems, and the gains that we may have made, that 50 years I was making reference to, we may return and we may lose those gains, not in a very, in a short time. And And really, there's been a lot of hard work put into making sure that there's really good management. And we heard there about, the 11 million, 15 million from Ethiopia, 12 million from other countries, committing to restoration and also doing a lot of restoration. But how do we do this differently? And I think this is where the opportunity of systems thinking comes in. And I think that's where the SDGs provide that window into systems thinking. And lastly, but not the least, systems leadership. We cannot solve the problems that we created over 50 years ago with solutions in 2022 with the same lens. We cannot, and we cannot afford it. And we have just this window of opportunity to do things differently. Thank you, Thomas, over to you.
Thank you so much, Musonda, for I would say, setting the agenda so clearly and connecting to other dots of the multilateral system. You've clearly outlined how important it is also to have a broad approach to forest issues with restoration, as we need to get to restore 350 hectares of forest by 2030, and also sustainable management. We need to achieve ensuring sustainable management of at least 860 hectares, million hectares of forest by 2030. Those needs are very important, and they need fund to make it happen. That's why I'm turning to Chris to ask this question about the financial needs we need. Those key items I just mentioned: deforestation, we need to combat, enhancing quality restoration, and fostering sustainable management. Those are the three main topical objectives we track at the GFS, plus the financial issue. According to publications we can review, we need at least around $60 billion every year to make it happen. We are far from this objective. I'd like to ask you, Chris, how can we scale up financial resources to bridge the gap with our objectives? And what is this the conservation international approach to this financial question? Thank you, Chris.
Great, thanks so much for this question. And I'm honored to be here with so many distinguished speakers. Just quickly to introduce myself, I've spent my career working on this question of funding, but really at the intersection of climate finance and carbon markets. So before joining Conservation International, I spent a decade working as a senior advisor to the Swedish climate program and at the Swedish Foreign Ministry's Green Climate Fund team. Over the last few years, these two fields of carbon and climate finance, once sort of siloed, are now converging. And this convergence is necessary if we have any hope of achieving the finance goals, which have already been detailed, and then of course, the temperature goals set in Paris in 2015. I would say there is some reason to be optimistic right now. It seems as though we have officially crossed into a new era of capitalism, the ESG era. We're in it now. Consumers are paying more attention now than ever before to the products that they're buying, the details of their pension fund, and the green credentials of the companies that they engage with. And I think we see regulators stepping up and increasing requirements on industry related to what they must disclose and what they can call green. And this movement on the regulatory side is a really important part of this convergence. But of course, we're here to talk about forests. The Glasgow Declaration on Forests and Land Use, it wasn't a standalone declaration. It was a political signal of support for the myriad initiatives and programs and commitments which operationalize and create real, meaningful action on the ground, including $1.7 billion to Indigenous peoples and local communities, $1 billion for jurisdictional REDD+ payments via the LEAF Coalition, and a commitment from the finance sector to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation from their $8.7 trillion portfolios by 2025. This is the kind of systemic and transformational approach that we need in order to tackle deforestation. And I would say for the first time, it seems like almost all of the relevant actors are finally stepping up to the plate. So this all sounds great. Can we just go home? I wish. What are we up against? And why is it so important for policymakers to implement financial carrots as well as sticks, incentives as well as disincentives? We need to increase the amount of money available for forest protection, restoration, while also addressing the finance that's making it more economically attractive to degrade and destroy critical habitat for short-term gain. current incentive structures are weighted so heavily towards unsustainable practices that forests are often worth more in the short term, dead than alive. A recent New York Declaration on Forest report found that the amount of private and public finance contributing to deforestation is 40 times higher than sustainable finance, 40 times. So this is a kind of market distortion that's all the more grotesque because it comes at the cost of irreplaceable damage to our natural world. And it has parallels to what we see with the fossil fuel subsidies, which as of last year were about $500 billion globally. But of course, people ask, where will we find all the money that's needed for the transition to a green economy? We hear that it's too expensive. So declarations are wonderful, but without immediate following action, they ring hollow. They ring hollow when commitments come and go without being met. They ring hollow as species go extinct. They ring hollow when Antarctica is 40 degrees hotter than it should be in March. And they ring hollow when for the last 5 years, we see no decrease in the millions of hectares of tree cover loss annually. Despite all of this, what can we do to remain hopeful? As we walk the road to Egypt next fall, we have to focus on 4 key themes. Firstly, by ensuring that the commitments made and ambitions announced on forest and land use are formally incorporated into upcoming NDC updates. Second, to support the development and execution of implementation plans, including timelines for how the funding committed will be dispersed. Third, establishing accountability mechanisms to track progress. And then lastly, engaging the public and private sector so that as money flows into flexible tools like carbon markets, whether that's Article 6 or voluntary markets, that this money is used intelligently, compassionately, and with the highest integrity. With all of this as the backdrop, I think there's a key role now for NGOs and civil society who have been already for years coming up with innovative ways to protect, manage, and restore. Conservation International has, for example, decades of experience on the ground fighting deforestation with innovative approaches to maximize the financial efficiency of our interventions. We have a track record which includes pioneering debt for nature swaps, the Blue Carbon Alliance, CI Ventures, the Critical Ecosystems Partnership Fund, where we partner with the French Development Agency, for example. And since 2001, CEPF has helped conserve more than 900 species and protect over 50 million hectares of key biodiversity areas. And we continue to push the envelope. I'm leading the work now of a new blended finance facility, which catalyzes early stage, high quality conservation projects and then scales them up using carbon markets. As the climate finance and carbon markets landscape enters this new ESG era, CI is at the leading edge, driving forward with a sense of urgency. We need to scale up action and scale up finance. So I encourage anyone watching to reach out to us or our partners and see how you can get involved.
Thank you so much, Chris. We will definitely zoom on this, the way you operate those funds later in the conversation. But you clearly pointed out one thing that was music to my ears in highlighting that it's important to fund the needs, but also it's also important to stop funding what causes the problems. And you made a parallel with fossil fuel subsidies, which was one of the key issues at COP26. I'm sure we will discuss this. And this is a good way into the question I wanted to ask to Jonathan, because we always know, Jane said it, we know what to do, and we know who are the game-changing actors, and definitely corporate leadership can make a huge difference in getting from declarations to implementation. And Jonathan, I wanted to turn to you. We just referred to the financial industry, which obviously can make a difference in ensuring the flow of money into the right direction. Who are the best and game-changing industries we need to partner with in order to make sure we achieve combating deforestation, enhancing restoration, and fostering sustainable management?
Thank you, and Thompson. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. In case you're wondering, the backdrop is not Shanghai, but it's Shanghai as I might wish it to be. The thing about the transition, and I'll maybe start a little broad and then come down specifically to forests, is that it is a universal transition. There is not a sector, there is not a use which will not be affected by this. It's universal. It's significant. It will require on the order of $275 trillion over the next 30 years to achieve a net zero scenario based on the Network for Greening the Financial Systems scenarios. It is also front-loaded in the sense that that money has to get spent today, that we need to see an increase in the spending on the affected land use and energy systems from where it is today at roughly 6% of global GDP up to about 9% over the next 10 years. And finally, it's uneven. This spending will occur in many places which do not have the money to pay for it. The transition will affect the most the people who can afford it the least. And that creates risk, of course. That said, this transition also creates tremendous opportunity, as what we are investing in is, of course, the biggest opportunity is to avoid physical climate risk. But beyond that, we're talking about developing, essentially reimagining our energy, our land use systems in a more resilient, more effective, more productive fashion. And that can and should be viewed as an opportunity, an economic opportunity too. So how do we get there from a corporate perspective? Because I think it's safe to say that we will have to crowd in private capital, that the governments of the world do not independently have the funding to do this, that there will be a requirement to pull in private capital. So how to do that and who to do that? Well, when we work with clients and when we see leadership, essentially it comes down to three fundamental actions they take. They disclose, they aim, and they act. And so the first aspect of leadership is their disclosure. And this is often a matter of signaling, but also a matter of creating transparency. They need to build the systems to hire the people to actually know what is their impact on the environment. Secondly, of course, they have to aim. They have to set a goal. And those things are relatively unique in a sense of competitive sense. People are looking at what is it taking for them to stand out, to differentiate, and that can be a very virtuous thing. We want more competition on environmental value. We want companies to stand out, to be clear that they are in fact setting higher targets, and that this should be to their benefit in the marketplace for consumers, for talent, and for investors. And finally, of course, they have to act. And all of this does come down to actually seeing for every industry leader, what are the actions, the programs they're taking that are measurable, that are transparent, that are visible. So if I take that now to the area of forests, I'd say, well, in forests and reforestation and more broadly in natural climate solutions, we have a particular challenge in creating the market architecture, if you will, for this. Corporations need guidelines. They need a couple of things. First of all, they need net zero certification. So what does that mean? Secondly, they need to have best practices. What are the ways in which we can be assured that the natural climate solution on offer is in fact a good one? They need to have a clear demand signal. For decades, the demand pricing for natural climate solutions has been too low to essentially incentivize people to invest against it. So we need to have a clear pull from the demand side. We need market architecture. By that, I mean that the normal things one should set up to create a market: liquidity, intermediaries, information, all market data, all these things need to be put in place. No different than creating a market for the spot trading of iron ore, but all that has to be built. And then finally, we need regulatory clarity, who is in charge, and trust. We need to actually have this conversation. So this seems like a long agenda, but we've done this before. We have created markets before, and markets will come into play if there is a strong enough pull for them. So I close by saying that if we're trying to figure out who is making the difference for forests, it's all of us. The alliances that are being formed, they have to include the financial players, and there are some that are leaders. But equally important, we have to include the members of the value chain that rely on natural capital directly. And with that, you could probably put pretty much every consumer goods company in the world. And of course, those who are directly participating in the value chain itself, as they are creating many of these projects. So all of these players have a role to play, and we should look at which ones are disclosing, what are they aiming at, and how high are they, and what are they doing?
That was very clear, and I take the opportunity of highlighting this importance of getting from setting targets to meeting targets that you've clearly outlined in your talk, in transitioning to Musonda again, because this needs partnership in the spirit of SDG 17. We can't achieve this objective of transformational change without a partnership between regulators and those who can make it on the ground all across the economy. This gives me the opportunity to remind our audience that you can ask questions to our panelists in flashing the QR code that happens to pop up on your screen. The question I just asked to Jonathan was response to the question we got from Chris in Kenya. And speaking about Kenya, so I'm getting to Musonda again. Musonda, the UNDP you're part of is ensuring the secretariat of the New York Declaration platform. We all know that, as I said, we can't achieve those objectives and the specific objective of the New York Declaration of 2014 without partnerships between North and South, corporate and public and private sectors. You work very closely with the G20 to ensure we move as fast as possible to this transformation. You've also been involved in EU-AU discussions. What are, to your eyes, the most critical enablers we need to focus on in international cooperation to boost the implementation of the Global Forest Agenda, according to you?
Thank you so very much for that question, Thomas. I mean, it's interesting that you asked us. You see, at UNDP, firstly, I want to say that within the UN system, we're the agency that has a presence on the ground in at least 140 countries. And by that, it obviously gives us a leverage into understanding what the political and the policy dynamics are at the national level. And so in referencing the G20, I think what was really critical and very important around the G20 discussions and also the G7 discussions, because obviously this center is an outcome of the G7, the Italian G7 presidency. I must say that it was really great to see in the G20 outcome documents, both in the Matera Declaration, but also in the summit itself, the Rome Summit, and also the Napoli Summit, the discussion and really highlighting the role of partnerships, but also the private-public connections. And as you very well know, with Italy and also the work that we do within the UNDP Climate and Forest team is to make sure that the enabling environment, but also the connecting factors. And I'll give a very classic example here. I mean, who doesn't wake up in Rome and have a cup of coffee? But where does the coffee come from? So obviously we talk about commodities. I see Jonathan is probably having his cup of coffee. And so we see these commodities such as coffee, cocoa, etc. So in partnering with, for instance, Casa de Postiti de Prestiti and other companies like Lavazza, working very closely, we've worked with them very closely in Latin America. We've worked with them in Ghana, for example, with cocoa, and bridging this, space. But also it really goes a little bit back to what Jonathan mentioned and a bit to what Chris mentioned as well, in terms of how do we make sure that, the environment is right and the connections matter and we understand what these markets mean. I think now more than ever is this element of transparency, but also the element of conversation. And so this is where we've seen that with these enablers, particularly around the funding streams, but also around understanding what these market systems look like, but also the element of justice, climate and, human rights issues. Some of these commodities are being sourced in very sensitive issues, and I think Chris alluded to that, where indigenous peoples need to be supported because some of these commodities are being sourced from there. So at UNDP, in really working around the NYDF, but also really more broadly around our forest issues, we make sure that we're bridging to the policy dynamics. And lastly, but not the least, I just want to give a very pragmatic example. The EU very recently passed a policy around the use of shea in its production systems, particularly for confectionery. Where's the shea coming from? Mostly Ghana, and most of it is coming also from Uganda, etc. But how do we understand these market dynamics and making sure that the sourcing is right, but also where the sourcing is happening, that the women and youth and all the other individuals that produce it, mostly traditionally, not mechanized, are also equally supported. So we need to understand, and now, as we've seen the Africa Free Trade Agreement actually now manifest, it is still connected to other regions, and particularly the European Union, and also other trade dynamics that have implications on forests. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Musonda. You've clearly outlined the impetus we had from this year's Italian presidency of the G20. It's important to remarkably note this because it was the first time that we had such an important part of the G20 leaders communique that referred to not only the environmental issues, but in general to the SDGs. And this impetus refers to the notion of leadership we need to get to implementation on the ground. And I'm turning back to Commissioner Sienkiewicz to talk about the European Union leadership role in that realm. Virginie, you've been clearly outlining the new initiatives that the EU Commission has launched over the past few months to make sure we achieved our objectives of combating deforestation, enhancing restoration, fostering sustainable management of forest. This revolves around different bills that the EU Commission has put on the table at the Parliament and the Council. Could you let us understand how those bills are supposed to interact with each other to make sure we meet all the targets that we've outlined this morning?
Thank you very much for your question, and very interesting thoughts from other speakers. So, I think what's very clearly what has to be said is that we, of course, do take forests very seriously for many reasons. When we talk about forests, we're usually talking about several things at the same time, and deforestation drives climate change. It's a major cause of biodiversity loss, and it robs people of their livelihoods. And in the EU, we know we are partly responsible, and we want to turn the things around. And as I mentioned earlier, we presented in November last year a legislative proposal to tackle deforestation. And we see this proposal as marking a turning point in the global fight, not just against deforestation, but against forest degradations as well. And building on FAO definitions, it addresses illegal but also legal deforestation. It obliges companies to clean up their supply chains and to get rid of products and commodities associated with deforestation. It's based around strict requirements for traceability, and it draws on the advantages of digital connected society. So the thinking is, with more transparency, it becomes possible to link commodities to the farms where they are produced. At the moment, it's a commission proposal, but the co-legislators are working extremely hard, and it's a priority file for EU members. And if it all goes well, the law should be adopted before the end of the year. We also have a related piece of legislation on the way, a new law on nature restoration, which should be also adopted soon. It's a law that recognizes that the protection is no longer enough. We need to start undoing some of the damage we have done to nature. Restoration will bring multiple benefits for climate mitigation and adaptation, for clean air and clean water, and all in all for, of course, human well-being. So the new law will apply in Europe, but it will also show the world that we are serious about our international goals of halting biodiversity loss around the globe. We want to show that it can be done, and there is always some sort of upfront investment, but our studies show that benefits of restoration are far greater than the initial outlay. So biodiverse forests, for example, are more resilient to climate change in the long run. And if we don't develop that resilience, our forests might not have a long run at all. So the proposals comes with two major elements. First, we have an overarching restoration objective, setting it for the longer term. And then we have binding targets for specific ecosystems, which are meant to grow in ambition over time. So those specific ecosystems are found in wetlands and peatlands, rivers and lakes, and of course in forest habitats. National plans prepared by the member states will ensure proper implementation of these targets. Funding will be key, and existing EU funds will be used for restoration. And we have also agreed to spend 10% of the EU budget on biodiversity as from 2026, which will be, I would say, of great leap and great help as well. Speaking of leadership, let me mention one last thing, which is our plan to plant at least 3 billion trees, additional trees in the EU by 2030. And this is a commitment made last year in the EU strategy for biodiversity. And it's not a question of announcing a figure for the beauty of the figure. In last July, we published a roadmap which underlines the importance of planting and growing the right tree in the right place for the right purpose. And we are in the final stages of publishing guidance on that, also identifying the funding opportunities that will help make it happen. most of these trees will be planted by forest professionals with the involvement of local authorities and local communities, because of course, it's not just about planting, it's really about ensuring that trees survive and thrive. And we want everybody to take ownership of the process. So we won't solve the climate crisis just by planting trees, but it certainly plays also a role, and it gets people engaged all across society.
Thank you, Virginie. You've actually outlined 4 R's, I would say. R1, reduction. It's important to reduce our footprint on nature. Second, R, restoration. It's now so degraded, we need to restore, as being said upfront by Susan Garner this morning from UNEP. Third are recovery, and you've clearly outlined EU's leadership in its recovery plan from COVID that invested a lot in the ecological transition, and specifically in its biodiversity strategy with this 4R, reforestation. You've launched this afforestation program in Europe, and it's 4 different R's that mean a lot to us today. A 5th R is reality. I'm turning to Jonathan again. Reality is very, very more complex than this broad policy discussion. We need to make sure to make it work on the ground in 2 contexts. The context of geopolitical instability, and I'm not here talking only about the Ukraine situation. I'm also referring to the fact that back and forth the US were in or out the multilateral system, in or out the Kyoto Protocol, in or out the Paris Climate Agreement. They might be back out if at some point there is a change in the US in the coming years. This geopolitical instability makes the reality very difficult to cope with in addressing forest challenges. One of the other instability we had was the clarification, I would say the operationalization of Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement. That is one of the outcomes of the COP26 in Glasgow. It is meant to bring regulatory clarity, as you pointed out earlier on. How do we make sure this clarification brings us fully operational economic mechanisms that we need to address ASAP, the climate crisis and the massive degradation of ecosystems we face? Do we have the norms, fragmentation, avoidance we needed, or are we still in the midst of an economic deregulated era?
Well, I think it's information that the norms are there, but the actual guidelines, the mechanisms, particularly when it comes to the scaling up of carbon markets, are still in process. But I sense, first of all, this is going much faster than it ever has. We've made more progress in the last 12 months than we've made in the last 12 years or 100 years when it comes to the realization of a functioning market. The problem is that it's still quite fragmented, and that we have a lot of people doing a lot of things in a lot of different ways all around the world. So what does it take to defragment it, to create interoperability, if you will, across these various carbon markets, to create a uniform recognized value of carbon, which is going to be critical for all the countries to realize, as was said, their national commitments. That I think at the Paris commitments, over 2/3 said that they would be doing this in reference to some kind of a carbon price. And we know that having a carbon discovery mechanism allows us to get the best solutions. And by that, including reducing that very massive capital expenditure otherwise that we would require. I think some studies have said it would reduce it by 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. So very important. So what does it take to get there? I think we did a little bit of looking around, what are some of the tactical issues here, the practical ones, and 4 jump out. The first is the legal basis for the market. It's like, what is the body of law, of legislation that a carbon market is tied to, that allows it to have an authority to compel consideration being given to the price, what happens when contracts are reneged on, so all the basic linkage to the national system. This is particularly true for North American, where we have a very broad body of environmental law that now we have to sort of somehow integrate with the notion of a carbon market. Secondly is monitoring and verification. And this is obviously critical from a technical perspective to simply understand what are the numbers. And so the clarity of the data, the ability to verify, this was true universally, I think, across all the experts we talked to, both in the United States and in China and to some extent in Europe. But particularly both major countries say, well, that's going to be an issue. If we can't create a third-party mechanism to monitor and verify, it's very hard to see these markets integrating and scaling. Thirdly, yes, politics. The reality of the fact that the advent of a carbon market and the commitment to it is something that will be a cross-administration feature. And so we really need to be able to say that there are ways, there is a cross-party, cross-country commitment to this. And again, particularly true in North America, but not by no means uniquely. In some cases, some people saw that the integration could be happening more at a regional level than on a global level. But either way, that barrier and essentially a consistent alignment is still there. And then finally, importantly, price management, that there in any stage of a scale up of a market, there's going to be a lot of volatility and there's occasionally going to be an absence of liquidity. And so creating a model whereby you can either put floors or caps, or at least inject more liquidity over time so that this market will avoid some of the typical teething problems was a concern, particularly I should note in Europe. So those four practical issues, nothing that is unresolvable. And I would note that they have all been resolved in other markets that we have scaled over time. And so in the case of this, we have, again, an existential risk to the balance sheet of the world. It seems only reasonable that we would start to invest, and we are investing, as I said, in the intermediaries, the information, and indeed the consensus that's needed to create this functioning market.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's a very clear-cut answer to this fragmentation issue I highlighted. Defragmenting the carbon markets, as you outline, is key, and it brings me back to this global strategy we need to have to connect the dots, and therefore I'd like to turn back to Virginius Sinkevicius before we move on and let him go. He will be off back at the EU Commission. Virginius, I had a last question to you about this. The EU is clearly perceived from across the globe as a standard setter in this realm, and so a key player in defragmenting carbon markets. The deforestation regulation you're passing, the restoration regulation you've introduced, also will have an impact on global supply chains, as the EU is one of the most influential markets on Earth. To make sure it does bring this defragmentation objective, you also partner directly with other regional entities or countries. And I'd like to know which one you have in mind to accelerate the implementation of the UN Global Forest Goals.
Yes, thank you very much. So I would say that our legislative proposal is part of a broader plan of actions to tackle deforestation and forest degradations, which were first outlined in 2019 in a Commission communication on forests. And already then we were aware that enhanced cooperation with both producer and consumer countries is crucial, is essential. So when preparing our new regulation, we engaged with third countries from the beginning of the process. For example, in the context of our cocoa dialogue with Ivory Coast and Ghana, we are convinced that we can only achieve the objective of halting global deforestation by working hand in hand with partner countries. And the Commission is therefore planning to set up its cooperation programs to make sure that EU partners are ready to reap the benefits of the incoming new rules on deforestation. The proposal includes specific commitments to help partner countries build the capacity of governments, the private sector, and civil society actors to work together to address the challenges of deforestation, with particular attention to the challenges faced by smallholders. And as you see, it's essential for us to make our efforts work by working with partner countries. At the same time, the EU market is not responsible for the global deforestation on its own. We therefore need to convince other big consumer countries such as the United States, China, India, and Japan. We need to join efforts to eliminate deforestation from every major market supply chains. And we need to convince everyone that actions targeting illegal deforestation are not sufficient to address the challenge we face. If we want to be serious about the objective, fighting deforestation, that I don't think anyone questions, then we need to be serious about the means. And by only tackling illegal deforestation, you can create an incentive for governments to consider deforestation as illegal, but we cannot afford the risk of such a perverse effect. So we will therefore further step up our efforts bilaterally, and of course using multilateral fora, and engage with other major markets to encourage them to take similar steps to reach the shared objectives of halting biodiversity loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Virginis, for this clear answer. I'd like to thank you very much for being with us today in the midst of the crisis management you also have to cope with. I'd like to welcome in the discussion Nick Bridge. I do recall to our audience that Nick has been the chief economist of the FCO in the UK, ambassador of the UK to the OECD, and he's now the special envoy of the UK Foreign Secretary for climate issues. So very much involved indeed in the COP26 delivery, which brings me back to this very, I would say, naive question, Nick, to you, about the value added of Glasgow. We know and we do value the fact that there has been this Glasgow Declaration on forest and land use by leaders committing from 141 countries, which is covering 90% of forest surface of the world. But didn't we have already a clear-cut roadmap in the 2014 New York Declaration on forests? What was the point of having another declaration?
Thank you so much for having me at the event, and I'm sorry to arrive late. Thank you for bringing me in. A great pleasure to be here with everybody. No, let's get straight to your point that all of previous efforts, I think Jonathan was referring to this, I heard when I came on the line, have been sincere but have failed. We absolutely needed to reshape how we thought about COP26, because we had not brought the climate goals, the emissions reductions, the adaptation and the financing together with the environmental and ecosystems realities. We hadn't aligned those agendas. And by the way, issues of forestry and agriculture and food, they resonate so much more directly with people, livelihoods, households, especially the poorest, most vulnerable billion people who are based in this livelihood, and also the consumers who are not thinking about how they consume and where they get it from, and so on. So we took a big effort at COP26 to renew our commitment, and the failure over previous years to halt and reverse forest loss needed tackling very directly. So this was a phenomenal coming together. You mentioned 90% of forests covered were signed up, 141 countries, 3 billion hectares, and that commitment to 2030 really, really is the last chance. It really has to stick. We're seeing the evidence out of the Amazon. We're seeing the evidence all over the world of soil degradation and so on. So we really wanted to put it profoundly at the center of a COP, and precisely because it is so interlinked with just transition, with the equality of the current inequality of the efforts to tackle the crisis. And we've begun to hear also some other colleagues mention, and I'll just broaden out the context for you. It was the first time that we pulled together for COP26 a sustainable supply chains, a dialogue between producers and consumers. We had the forest, agriculture and commodity trade dialogue that actually got to the root of the demand pull as well as the supply push. And I'll pause there, but just to briefly, obviously reinforce what Jonathan said about the whole question of, having the agreement. Now it's about enforcement and monitoring and verification and implementation of these commitments. But I think that combination of new efforts at COP26 are hopefully really critical to making the progress we have to make.
Thank you so much, Nick, for highlighting the other aspects that relates to this Glasgow Declaration. I was indeed very curious about knowing on your sustainable supply chain dialogue, and we will talk about sustainability of supply chains in the course of our discussion around the economical questions revolving around forests, the second session of today's 2022 Global Forest Summit. As I said earlier on, we, in this type of event, which is not a diplomatic event, it's a civil society-led event, advocate for making sure we get from pledges to results. And one of the results we had from COP26 was also the operationalization of Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement to display a rule book for carbon markets. Jonathan earlier on explained the importance of making sure those rule books, national or regional rule books, are interoperable. Because at the end of the road, there are actors like Conservation International using those funds, leveraging on climate finance to boost action for protection, restoration, and sustainable management of forest. I'd like to turn to Chris in knowing how you can use those climate funds and how you need those rule books to be more interoperable and probably improved itself.
Great, thanks for that. Well, first I should say well done by the UK presidency in Glasgow to get us a rule book. Article 6 provides an avenue for countries to channel financial flows from public and private sources towards important domestic carbon mitigation activities. And one of those important areas is, of course, natural climate solutions, including protection, restoration, and improved forest management. But we only just now have the rules in place, and they are relatively high level. So it will likely take some time before we see, for example, the first bilateral trades of land use credits under 6.2, which is the bilateral trading between countries. And then likely even longer before we see an Article 6.4 trading mechanism up and running. That's the successor to the Clean Development Mechanism. But we need to be able to act now to finance forest protection of critical and irreplaceable ecosystems. And I'm also a fan of the R for reality. The voluntary carbon market is a very well positioned as well, with more than a decade of effort having gone into setting up rulemaking and methodologies to provide solutions that allow for finance to flow immediately. So I would say that the VCM, the voluntary market, and Article 6 can exist and thrive simultaneously for now, even if there could be a harmonization of these two tracks over time, depending on the speed and direction host countries wish to take going forward. One of the ways in which CI is harnessing the power of carbon markets is through the fund that I'm managing. So I'll just spend a few minutes talking about that. We created a blended finance fund focused on natural climate solutions in order for CI to be able to implement the cutting edge science and policy work that we pursue together with many partner organizations. It's one thing to put out a paper describing the potential for a new carbon methodology, but it's another thing to be able to follow that paper and work with the same brilliant scientists and researchers who authored it to implement the cutting edge project on the ground. And we want to be able to utilize these new methods in order to create carbon assets, which put a value on the protection or restoration of millions of hectares of land. This is the kind of thing we're actively engaged in with our new NCS fund. The thesis for the fund is simple and twofold. There's a need, firstly, to take risk and catalyze the market for early stage protection, restoration, and improved forest management activities. And second, to push the topic of quality as relentlessly and specifically as possible by putting local communities and people at the top of the priority list. So it's a philanthropically funded vehicle, and we're seeking donors, both public and private. But in addition, we're also looking to scale up private sector engagement. We partner with aligned private sector actors, either for downstream sale of credits or for co-investment upstream. And this is especially needed for large restoration projects, which tend to have the very big ticket sizes. So we implement the project at the project scale, but then we include nested or scaled up jurisdictional activities where feasible. Other goals include sharing lessons learned transparently with the wider market, leveraging private sector co-finance. We have a co-finance goal of a ratio of 1 to 10, so crowding in $10 of co-investment for every dollar that we spend. And on quality, we're really trying to kind of get out in front of this topic. It receives a lot of attention, but it's often light in the way of specifics. So we have a goal, we've come out with quality guidance for carbon market transactions, which are called the Principles for Investment in Natural Climate Solutions. When investing in NCS, for example, via carbon markets, CI approaches the question of quality really as a continuum. So you have supply on one side and you have demand on the other side, supply quality, demand quality. In order to avoid potential greenwashing, we need to ensure that we have quality at both ends of the spectrum and not to confuse the two. So for example, it's not a bad conservation project just because a company makes a questionable claim regarding the carbon credits that it produces. Essentially, the principles provide 3 simple guides to ensure quality of supply and 3 to ensure quality of demand. On the supply side, we need an equitable focus on people, including indigenous and local communities. We call that the CCB standard or equivalent, that's climate, community, and biodiversity, including third-party verification. And that activities comply with national policy and strict carbon accounting and conservativeness. And then on the demand side, which gets surprisingly little attention when it comes to a quality transaction, just as one might imagine there to be important due diligence done on potential sellers or project proponents, we encourage all market participants to ensure that the purchasing of credits for offsetting is done only under certain circumstances. For example, in order to purchase credits from CI, we require that companies are on a documented and disclosed path to net zero by 2050, with a halving of emissions by 2030, and are only seeking to offset residual emissions. So that means that they are only buying credits which will be used as offsets with a use case of the hardest to abate emissions. If they can't show this, or they stop showing it at a future date, then they're in violation of our policy. And this is really key to creating and encouraging ambition via carbon markets. Carbon markets, I think they can be a really important tool for raising ambition, both corporate ambition as well as national ambition. And this is something that often gets lost. Lastly, on the supply side, on the demand side, we don't partner with companies whose majority business is fossil fuels. Enabling fossil fuel sector to continue business as usual while greenwashing practices like advertising carbon neutral petrol at the pump is not something we're willing to support. And personally, I think this is the kind of thing that has the potential to turn public opinion against effective tools like carbon markets. On prioritization, we utilize our own pioneering work on irrecoverable carbon and biodiversity hotspots. And then we have exclusions. For example, we require that activities maintain or restore natural ecosystems where they belong and have existed historically. So that means we don't support, for example, afforestation projects in geographies that were historically grasslands. Carbon markets show immense potential to get finance flowing for forests. And of course, there's great responsibility that market actors have now, especially with so many new entrants coming in order to ensure that the market maintains a high level of integrity as it expands and grows. So everyone has a role to play here. Companies should do what they do best. They should seek out partners and use their balance sheets to invest in great projects. Public and private donors should reach out to CI or our partners and invite us to tell you more about what we're doing and how we're continually trying to scale up efforts. There's no time to waste.
Thanks. There is no time to waste, Chris. Thank you so much for this very clear answer. I remind to our audience that you can ask questions to our panelists all throughout the day in flashing the QR code that happens to be on your screen. If I can't ask the question during this panel, I take the questions for the next ones as well, because there are many cross-cutting questions I can use for next discussions. And I'm saying so in turning back to Nick Bridge, a special envoy from the UK Foreign Secretary for Climate. There is no time to waste, and no time to waste in sustaining the Glasgow momentum, as I would say. So I'm asking you this question. The UK has chosen a very specific and developed strategy to make sure of the success of the COP26, sharing the COP with Italy as chair of the G20, while the UK was also chairing the G7. So that Cornwall Summit, Rome Summits were milestones to prepare the Glasgow. Expect the G7 German presidency this year and the G20 Indonesian presidency to take the baton from what you've done, especially in times when the US envision asking for the removal of Russia from the G20. I'm curious to know how you envision the geopolitical context to maybe blow down our hopes, and maybe how do you work also with the next COP presidency in Egypt to keep sustaining the Glasgow momentum?
Thank you. Well, we're already having great conversations with our Egyptian partners. The UK and Egypt collaborated a few years ago back at the UN to try and jumpstart the adaptation conversations that were not going fast enough. And we've been great partners ever since. So really pleased that they're taking over. We're intensively discussing strategy and collaboration. And also delighted then that we have clarity that the United Arab Emirates will follow on, and we have a sort of glide path that we can understand. We were deliberately at COP26 pushing as hard as we could. Now, remember, we're trying to keep together. Look at the world right now, and I'll come back to Russia in a moment, but look how hard it is to get agreement on anything. And actually at COP26, to get that agreement across all those parties, with all those different perspectives, politics, cultures, economies, and the deep anger and frustration in civil society and in indigenous communities and in the poorest, most vulnerable communities, that not enough is being done. To try and get agreement across all of that, was really tough. But we did try to set out that, everybody had to do more. Everybody had to choose their pathway, but it had to fit into a sufficient collective effort. Really pleased, obviously, that the new German government has been so dynamic. It's already made some very important appointments, has great expertise, and I can tell you, we are feeling very strongly Germany's determination to put this at the centre of its thinking in the months ahead. So that is great. Indonesia was our co-chair, including my co-chair in the FACT, the Forest Agriculture Commodity Trade Dialogue that I hosted and then our ministers hosted with Indonesia. So Indonesia has enormous self-interest and determination also as G20 presidency to move forward. And we heard from the EU before about the way that we can come together politically on supply chains. So, looking forward, that is all pretty optimistic. Now, Russia-Ukraine situation, obviously the extraordinary gravity of that and the significance of that for geopolitics going forward. But let me focus on the geopolitics of energy around that question. Europeans are now determined to move off Russian oil and gas urgently, and there's some very impressive statements of intent and actions going on. We have been providing the Russian state with hundreds of billions of euros of finance for its oil and gas for many years, at a time when clean energy by and large has been cheaper. But we haven't made that very difficult transition to the clean energy systems fast enough. And this has certainly given us the most profound incentive to accelerate that. So this shift of Russian oil and gas is part of a wider and essential acceleration of our transition. And I think that every country is seeing the transition as both a collaborative issue, but also a competitive issue. The countries want to be there first in the clean, green technological space. And that is something that can be a threat if countries go down different pathways on standards or different ways of securing the natural resources or the rare earths. But it can also be an opportunity to bring us together. I just come back to my first point that it was the COP26 multilateralism last year that worked and that brought every country together around this shared agenda. So let's use this common, this proof of concept. But as you've said, and to the event today, multilateralism, has worked in this space, but it's not enough. We need to crowd in, and we try to do this at COP as much as possible. We need to crowd in the voice or different ways of securing the natural resources or the rare earths, but it can also be an opportunity to bring us together. I just come back to my first point that it was the COP26 multilateralism last year that worked and that brought every country together around this shared agenda. So let's use this common, this proof of concept. But as you've said, and to the event today, multilateralism, has worked in this space, but it's not enough. We need to crowd in, and we try to do this at COP as much as possible. We need to crowd in the voice of young people, of businesses, of the financial system, because everything's got to go net zero in the next few years. 93 months to go before we've halved global emissions. 93 months before we have to halve global emissions. So all the work to do.
Thank you. You've clearly outlined the need to crowd this race to zero, and that's the purpose of this multi-stakeholder platform today. Precisely, we will have talks about this with other firms and NGO leaders that can feed this process. You highlighted the importance of avoiding a competitive transition and instead of a collaborative transition. That's key here in the midst of this geopolitical crisis, where China has also a role to play. And I'd like to turn to Jonathan Wetzel, senior partner at McKinsey again, based in Shanghai today. China is a key player in this transition at the global stage. You've been reviewing this potential leverage at the McKinsey Global Institute for years. China has become the first emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. It also is a country that has domestic tree cover loss of 6.4% since the 20s, according to the Global Forest Watch. It's a country that, not putting it on the spot, but highlighting the important role of China in discussing this issue, that rely a lot on innovation rather than nature-based solution in its sustainability policy, while China is chairing the COP15 on biodiversity, biological diversity this year. And as we have not reached any agreement so far on the post-Aichi framework on biodiversity, which revolves a lot around forest protection, as forests do account for 80% of terrestrial biodiversity, I'm looking at your knowledge about Chinese policy in putting China as a positive game changer for forests.
Well, thank you again, Thomas. It's a great question, and happy to talk about the perspective from Shanghai. So I have changed my backdrop to reveal that. I think that the announcement of the 2030-2060 goals in October of 2020 was a game changer as far as China's approach to the broad topic of climate. Not that they hadn't sort of been heading in this direction before. And I would note that on the physical climate risk side, China has been one of the first nations to create a climate adaptation plan, and was actively investing in that back in, I think it was started in 2013. So it's but the declaration in 2020 really put a point under it, and as it of course came from the very top. And it has defined a pathway on both mitigation and adaptation that I think is now, it's really accelerating. I think in line with those expectations of disclose, aim, and act. We have a massive amount of disclosure happening now. So every listed company in China will be declaring their scope 1, 2, 3. And with that, the growth of the world's largest carbon market now is already established in China. So I feel like that the message has clearly gotten there. Now, if we turn specifically to natural-based solutions and what's going on there, I feel like that there is, again, these barriers. We said that we need to have clarity around what's a net zero certification and the market architecture. But in the absence of that, China can actually move quite quickly as a state. And so the state actors would say that essentially everything that they had done in the 13th five-year plan, in the 14th five-year plan, they'll do twice as much, roughly. And that includes reforestation, that includes coastline protection, that includes renewable energy development and so forth. So it's roughly a 2x on the amount of investment and the rate of progress. Now, to be very clear, a 2030 and a 2060 target here is not a net zero trajectory. That misses the target by at least half a degree. And so we're going to need to see a overperformance in China on its targets if we're going to hit net zero. But that said, I think it's not unreasonable that they have a tendency to softball their targets initially and in the expectation of over delivering. So we'll see, but I think it's important to keep up the pressure. So a couple of things that will happen that are in the plan, though. Again, these are pretty, reasonable targets. No question they can do it. So reforest another 1 million hectares of land over the next 5-year plan. That's up from the 500,000, give or take, which was the target in the 13th 5-year plan. There's a whole agenda around urban infrastructure. I'm sure everybody's heard about sponge cities and sort of the idea of introducing natural-based solutions into the city as a way of supporting the extremes of climate adaptation that are increasingly, obviously, people remember the Zhengzhou flood that happened over the summer. That was a good example of what not to do. In a sense, they've had to learn from that and the importance of integrated urban planning as part of this idea of introducing natural-based solutions. But there's no backing away from it. And I think the last point is that ultimately in China, a lot of it comes down to the land. And so how we use the land, what's the highest best purpose of the land, and recognizing the value of the land. And I'll say this is a global opportunity. I think China can lead the way in this notion of nature as a land value capture mechanism. The value of natural capital should be embodied in the value of the land. And that we're literally investing a reasonable amount, but a small number compared to the total value of our wealth on the planet, 70% of which is actually in our land, it's in our real estate. So we are essentially investing to protect our wealth, and that we should attribute the value of that protection to these mechanisms. And I think China is moving quite quickly to embed that in its real estate markets and its property markets, sort of the single largest financial markets on the planet. I think this will be a fascinating development in the financial sphere as well as in the policy sphere.
You've one of the things you've said as highlighted as drawn my attention. You said China was the first country to have adopted an adaptation plan and strategy, which is indeed very important as we're deepening into the climate crisis, and that's a way of positive leadership we wanted to know about from the Chinese government and Chinese presidency of the COP 15 CBD. But before we get to adaptation, we still need to mitigate the climate crisis, and conservation of our forests is key, as forests are both a carbon sink, natural carbon sink, and also if deforestation grows, then we also feed carbon emissions. It accounts for at least 50% of carbon emissions, deforestation per se. So I'm turning back to Chris from Conservation International. When we decided to have Conservation International part of the International Advisory Board of the Global Forest Summit, it was precisely because conservation first, as some could say, echoes what we said: protect first. Protection is key. Protect faster before restore stronger or manage better. We have an order in the motto of the Global Forest Summit. I would say combating deforestation is the first main battle in this war for forests that we are in the midst of and that we need to win. I'd like to know from your perspective, how can we catalyze this conservation agenda? Are there other policy options and tools we have not used so far in the global community?
Thanks for that. And I wish I had an updated backdrop for that question. I really like the sentiment to protect faster before we restore stronger and manage better. The setup, for example, of the vehicle that I was mentioning earlier is reflective of this need to prioritize protection. We set aside 50% of the fund's resources to protect critical landscapes first. And at the same time, we're of course seeing lots of motivation to pursue restoration and improved management. So we're devoting resources to these important avenues as well. How do we catalyze the conservation agenda? I think it's happening. I think it's being driven by this ESG fueled convergence that I was mentioning before. It seems reasonable to say that there's more finance and momentum now to do conservation than ever before, but the finance still doesn't match the need that's there, because of course the situation is also so much more dire than it's ever been. So yeah, how do we catalyze the conservation agenda? Right now, I think it's about creating viable opportunities to invest. We've all heard the commitments and we've seen the pledges, and now we need to be able to say, here's your investment opportunity, nation X or corporate actor Y or foundation Z. Here's how you can invest in and fund nature. So that's one of the major things that we spend our time on, creating those opportunities, and then once created, ensuring through design and implementation that everything we do puts people at the top of the priority list. So I've been really convinced by the idea that we don't have permanence without putting people first. How do we catalyze conservation? I think it's by creating these high quality investment funding opportunities.
Thanks, Chris. That brings us back to the idea that forests are assets in a natural capital. Those are words that to some ears could sound puzzling, because we don't see nature as an economic object. But indeed, creating investment opportunities, quality investment opportunities, is part of the conservation agenda. And this is not the only way to see nature and forests in particular. We have to put it back into a more global perspective. That's why I'm turning back to Musonda Mumba from UNDP. Because as you said, Musonda, in your first statement, 2022 is a special year. It's where we mark the 30th anniversary of the three main UN conventions around the environment: the UNFCCC for climate, the UNCCD for desertification, and the UNCBD for biodiversity. And I'd like you to let us understand how you interlink those three conventions. How do they form a nexus for forest? And how can we make sure it does fit in a more global agenda for sustainability? As you usually say, I've heard that from you several times, we mark the 30th anniversary of Rio, but we have to think post the 2030 agenda too, which was emerging in Rio firsthand.
No, thank you very much for that question and point, Thomas. I think what we have entered, we've entered a very pivotal moment in human history, and I think this has been alluded by many speakers, particularly around referencing the IPCC. Here we are, and there's a demonstration that something is not right. And so what the Rio Conventions do, and I'm glad that Chris referenced to the fact that this is about people. And when we talk about how people make decisions at the political level, be it sort of multilateral or otherwise, we do know that communities ultimately are not looking. Somebody doesn't wake up and go to a farm and think, this element kind of relates to UNCCD, and then this element relates to CCC, and that element is to CBD. No, this is their life. It's a very holistic way of referencing a landscape. And as such, land, the very biodiversity that we're dependent on, the very fact that, our food was probably very colorful this morning with a fruit that was red, another that was yellow, another that was green, is something that talks to us about land, how we've used land to source our food, or even implications to climate. And similarly, what is actually leading to degradation, something that Agnes Kalibata alluded to. And then lastly, but not the least, to the point about the global nature of thinking beyond 2030. As I said earlier on, here we are talking about 50 years of environmental governance. Stockholm at 50 is happening in June. We don't have 50 years. And I'm glad that, Inga Anderson in just the recently passed UN Environment Assembly made reference to that, together with also past executive directors such as, our administrator at UNDP, Iucn Steiner, made reference to that as well. We don't have those 50 years at all. And so in going beyond 2030, I think 2030 is the pivotal moment, and we start today to really look at the importance of planetary health. Elements of One Health, for example, how do we deal differently with how we deal with the planetary nature of how the convergence of these three streams of work come together. And I think when we begin from there, we begin to deal with issues differently, be it business, be it economics, be it social even, or even environmental. Let us put planetary health at the center and also people at the center of this discussion as well. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Musonda, for this clear-cut answer. I have one last question to Nick before he leaves us, because he has a commitment that he needs to abide by. Based on what you said, Musonda, about this need to think beyond 2030, I'm curious on what I call next generation type of policy. You clearly outlined, Nick, that COP26 delivered a very unique consensus, a universal agreement, commitment that was not seen for years, indeed in the global community, probably since the Paris Climate Agreement, actually. But there is a need to go beyond what was achieved in Glasgow, not saying it was rubbish, but thinking forward. And in thinking forward, there is always this question reverting back from civil society that at some point, due to this global emergency for climate and especially for forest, there is a need for accountability. I'm not thinking about accountability from countries specifically, but accountability for those who do deforest on the ground, who are responsible at some point for ecocide crimes. Is there at some point a policy avenue you see in this international arenas where we will see some sort of environmental justice emerging that we've been discussing since the Rio summit?
Well, there's no doubt, as we've just heard from all the other participants, Dr. Mumba as well, about the extent of the degradation that we're facing. And I won't comment directly. I've talked to, I think, some of the people working on these important questions, and they should continue. But there is no doubt that the evidence is coming forward at an accelerated pace everywhere as to just how far we've gone. And I think people in this room understand the urgency and the extent of the climatic instability and the environmental ecological degradation that we already have, but it's not possibly widely understood even after COP26. So the IPCC studies, really did make a difference. The scientific studies really did make a difference, but we need to move those studies and those realizations into the hearts of our governments, into the national security frameworks of our governments, so that we really then translate these trajectories into proper risk-based approaches and then tackle these issues with the urgency they require. One of the things that you notice is that how often things are happening now, not just years or decades, but even a century ahead of what we expected. So I completely, accept and agree that the extent of the degradation has been appalling and continues. There's obviously, I think, as Jonathan was picking up, a whole array of issues around enforcement of current regulations. One of the concerns, with COP that we said from the beginning is that, well, firstly, it's not enough and it needs to continue, but we've kept alive 1.5. But secondly, this is just the beginning and the easier part. The implementation and the action is the harder part. So if we think about human nature and what moves people and what really grabs people's attention, it has to be made to feel real. So we have to keep the stories coming, the real stories of the massive impacts already happening. We have to keep the risk awareness high, but also we have to show people a positive pathway. So I think we really need to be honest about the scale of the problem, not see this as doom mongering or anything like that, but just straightforward analysis and honesty about the scale of the problem. But then we can follow it up with an extraordinary set of opportunities, an extraordinary sense of the benefits to our economies and our societies. In fact, the only way our economies and societies can survive and flourish is to double down on this action. So I'm sorry I haven't directly tackled your question on the legal forward pathways, but suffice to say that we will be continuing to see an acceleration of impacts, and that will lead to an accelerated need for countries to really have plans that are not just plans, but are actually locked in legally, in regulatory in enforcement terms locked in. So this points to really one thing we were trying to do at COP26 was get this out of the climate bubble or out of the climate negotiating bubble and make this a whole of society recognition and a whole of society effort as we move forward. And we need all the people in the room to do that.
Thanks, Nick. We needed a clear-cut answer with taking into account all constraints that diplomatic negotiations need to compute in delivering an agreement. You've been crystal clear on the constraints and the boundaries we have here. I wish you best luck in the next negotiations you will be part of. And we will take questions now from our audience. I'll distribute them to our speakers, Jonathan, Chris, and Musonda. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank our audience for sending so relevant questions. I'll ask our speakers, as we have 10 minutes to address them, to be rapid in taking them. The first question would go to Chris and Jonathan in that order, is that it relates to carbon markets, fast-growing opportunities, and a concern for quality of carbon markets that do exist. How to make sure that there is quality funding indeed available for project leaders? First to Chris and then to Jonathan.
Sure, thanks for that. Well, I mean, that's essentially what I spoke quite a lot about. The quality piece is essential to get right, and to get right ex ante before we get too deep into the markets. And Jonathan mentioned the need for liquidity. We absolutely need liquidity in the market in order to have standardized contracts and to be able to scale up. But if we rush to that before ensuring that we have trust and integrity in the market, then I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot and potentially endangering the market as a whole.
Back to basics of financial regulation and financial efficiency, liquidity of the market, trust and integrity in the market. It brings us back to the 28th financial crisis. Jonathan, do you share the same view as Chris as for quality requirements for carbon markets?
Well, yes, and I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. So more transparency, more disclosure, a whole set of, I mean, auditing these projects is a growth business. So that will be something that we should expect to see more intermediaries do. And then with that, meta registries, so things that are publicly available, that are easily accessible to understand the quality, the pricing, the sponsorship of all these projects. I mean, there's no reason these things should be secret. And so creating that transparency, I think, is job number one to drive the growth of the marketplace. So.
Thanks. Indeed, it revolves around the work of the task force on nature-related disclosure that the central bankers and financial regulators have been working with on for years now. And we need to stress out the importance of the financial industry in making this shift. The second question we had was asked by Paulo from Brazil. I'd like to ask it to Musonda first and then to Jonathan again. It's about the sustainable supply chain question. How can we make sure that we indeed have sustainable supply chains? What are the criteria of sustainable supply chains? I would like to ask Musonda this question in looking specifically at the social aspect of sustainability in sharing value across the supply chain, and to Jonathan focusing more maybe on the economic criteria of what makes it sustainable. Maybe Musonda first.
Thank you so very much for that question. I think the important thing which we as UNDP have been really working on is also making sure that we look at the human rights lens of looking at sustainability as well. And I think, Commissioner from the EU made reference to it, this importance also of traceability, I think, which is also very, very important because we are in a global village and we're very much interconnected, and we cannot not be aware of where the sourcing of a number of these commodities are coming from. And similarly, at the national level, as UNDP, we've been also supporting countries and member states in particular to make sure that they understand where the policies are in terms of, where is the sourcing of coffee, for instance, what are the frameworks and national mechanism to make sure that, the social elements are taken into account, the human rights elements are taken into account, even as commodities. And I think lastly, but not the least, this issue of leakage. I think we have heard from, Commissioner Mckinnon, who mentioned that, the issue of this illegal sourcing, this has to be curbed. I think this has severe implications on sustainability on both ends of the supply-demand chain as well. And I think it's an important element to take into account. Over to you.
Thanks, Musonda. Back to Jonathan about the economic features of quality, sustainable supply chains.
Well, I think increasingly that sustainability in both an environmental and a social sense as an externality is going to be built into the expectations of every supply chain. It's just that there won't be any non-sustainable supply chains, that there will be such both regulatory and consumer and investor pressure that every supply chain will start to need to level up, if you will. The question will back to I'm going to sound like a broken record here, is about transparency. It's about disclosure and understanding at each step of the chain, what is everybody doing? And I think it's that is, of course, where digital and technologies come into play. So that is, that I think is the answer here, is to create that transparency largely through digital models that allow the market to work. And so there should be a market for sustainability, because we know we need it. We need to have suppliers compete on sustainability so they can show that in a social and an environmental and yes, an economic fashion that they are sustainable. I don't think there's any alternative to that. So, and by the way, the figment of the idea that we're all going to reshore and do everything at home, not happening. We simply don't have the time to do that, for one thing, nor the capabilities. So we are stuck with a global supply chain. So what we need to do is act as a global as a global community to embed the values in that supply chain that we think are going to allow it to continue to perform its purpose, which is to provide us all with the goods and services we need for everyday life.
Musonda and Jonathan for answering that question from Paulo, and thanks to Paulo for asking this from Brazil. This is also a question we will explore during session 2 about all economic aspects of protecting forest, enhancing restoration, and fostering sustainable management of forests. This is also a question we will address in session 3 about the best practices of sustainable management. Indeed, as the first root of a supply chain is precisely the way we exploit our forests. I'd like to raise now the question that came from Teresia in Kenya, that I asked to Musonda first and Chris second, about the very quite simple idea that deforestation is fueled by poverty, because in some communities, governments or local people need to use to exploit forests for a living, and that combating deforestation is not only about global supply chains with multinational firms, it's also about the way we share value on the ground and make it a livable economy on the ground. So I'm asking this to Musonda from the UNDP perspective, as you work on development processes and sustainable growth, obviously, and then to Chris on the way it reverts back to the conservation agenda.
No, thank you very much for that question from Kenya. I think I want to make 2 examples here. Firstly, I want to say that yes, your assumption is right, and we're beginning to see this, and we've seen this for a very long time, that obviously the absence of alternatives has actually exacerbated the levels of degradation and use of biofuels. And we know from a report that the UN Environment produced over 6 years ago that we will continue, particularly on the African continent, to still be dependent on biofuels up into 2050. But how do we manage that? And this brings me to my second example. We have seen how, for instance, UNDP, together with the government of Rwanda, and I think this is a very good example of where policy shift at the national level are very, very critical. When the world was plunged into the whole crisis of COVID, I don't even think that the world was aware that for the first time in history on the African continent, President Kagame put in place a policy mechanism that nobody in the city of Kigali, a city of 1.4 million people, will be using charcoal for cooking. And this is under the very point that there's a lot of pressure of a lot of wood coming from the very landscapes that this country and the world is dependent for, the Virunga landscape where they have, the mountain gorillas. And what did he do to make sure that this gap is actually managed? It was impressive because there was a policy shift in terms of, access to gas and access to other, alternative energy sources for the city and for its citizenry, and the options that there were for its citizenry. And this is doable and workable, all with policy change. And I think this is where now governments are being implored. And we know, since you're from Kenya, within the East Africa community, that even Kenya had banned the use of charcoal. But of course, we see the leakage because most of this, illegal charcoal that's coming in from Uganda. So already we see how porous these mechanisms are and how they need to be, curbed even at that sort of regional level. And so there's a lot of work to be done, but especially at the policy shift, but also the alternatives and, options for local people and for citizenry. Over.
Thanks, Musonda. Chris, it's on your turn.
Great. Well, I can only second everything that Dr. Mumba said. Yeah, I think it's a development problem as well, of course. And so following the comments just made, yeah, charcoal, artisanal mining, these are development issues that are interwoven with deforestation. And all of the projects that we work on, therefore, really put people first and try to ensure that as much revenue as we can goes back to local communities. And the other key piece to kind of interweave always is a local livelihoods component. So I've spoken a lot about carbon markets here. I think we need to ensure that we have a holistic approach to the kinds of projects that we're working on, the programs that we're working on. And if we have certain revenue streams coming from markets, that's great, and that's really important. But we should ensure that we have a long-term livelihoods component always in there in every activity and program that we're working on in landscapes. If that's not there, Jonathan mentioned market volatility and uncertainty over time. It's not something that I think we can just purely rely on. We have to weave in those development and livelihoods components.
Thank you so much, Chris. Well, I'd like to thank the six of you, and especially the three of you that remained up to the end of this panel discussion that gave us the opportunity of drawing a complete policy portrait of what is at stake after Glasgow and moving towards the end of the 2030 road map. Thank you, Jonathan, for being with us from Shanghai. Thank you, Musonda, for being with us from Nairobi. And thank you, Chris, for being with us, I guess, from Geneva? I'm not sure. Anyway. And I'll actually wrap up because from this policy conversation, we will hear an insight of a project leader which turns this reflection into action on the ground. I will introduce him very soon, and we move to the next step. Thank you so much to the three of you. So our guest for this insight of a project leader is Zulkifli Nasution, the founder of UNCCD in Indonesia. Zulkifli, I'm happy to host you, and I do hope you had a chance to listen to this high-level policy conversation we just had with Musonda Muba, Nick Bridge, Virginia Sinkevicius, Jonathan Wetzel, and Chris Zink. And I do hope it fed you with hope because you're on the ground acting for forest in Indonesia, and I'd like you to explain to us what you do yourself for forest.
Yes. First of all, thank you for inviting the UNCCD to attend the Global Forest Summit, and we are able to hear the philosophy and the high quality and in scientific from the distinguished speakers. I'm just like hearing the lecture at the university and the meeting at the good building at the government, but it is not to touch the earth and not touch the environment. What we do is we make the cooperation with some institution like Reforestation, VNV, Climco, Green Step Group, Handprint, One Planted, King and Poor Project, and they support us to be implementer of the planting the mangrove and the planting of the some trees in the land. Now, 6,000 hectares still going on in planting. Around 200 hectares already finished planted by the COP, and beside that we have to educate the people, because without any educate the people in the village not care about what we have to do, and we have to change the behavior of the village people, the attitude and ways and thinking, specifically those related to the management of natural resources and the ecosystem. Without that, we will fail. I'm telling you that it's very easy to make it like a philosophy, like the education of conservation, but it is very difficult to apply to the people on the village, because they don't understand, not due to they don't want, but they don't understand what's still done now in decreasing of the ecosystem. And then we teach them to restore of the match forest and coastal ecosystem for climate changing and mitigation and adaptation. What we have to do is, when we explain some information to them, nobody knows what is the global warming. And they said it is the same since 10 years ago, since 20 years ago, since 30 years ago, up to now, no any changing in the world. So what we have to do it. And then by the time, month by month and a year, and they start to be understand. And beside that, we have to improve the economic, the people in the village. Without that, we will fail. Because the advancing the economy of the coastal, for instance, the communities with the pattern of coastal community empowerment based on the local wisdom in an effort to solve the problem of the coastal communities and make them independent, and by utilizing the existing local wisdom. Yes, I tell you, for instance, last time they changing the land to be the fish pond, and then they took the mangrove plant to be a charcoal. And when we have to teach them and how to make a fish pond on a sustainable use with the planting a mangrove inside 30% inside the pond, and then the productivity of the fish, the production of the fish inside the pond will increase in 25% from the before, and they are happy on it, and they follow our system, the silver fishery. That silver fishery, they will follow what we talk to them without any proof. Even we say that it is by research, the higher research at the university, and some institutions said that it is the result of the PhD research. Nobody will follow it without any proof to the people on the village. That the problem is the problem in the field. So we have to make a restoration. Without any education, without any research and how to do it with the local wisdom, and to teach them what the importance of biodiversity for them, not for the world, for them. If we just only tell to biodiversity for the world, don't care about it. We should tell them that it is very important to them, and they believe us. And I believe, and the next we can get the green economy improvement of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zulkifli, for this very clear, I would say, witnesses from the ground. We need to connect the dots from policy statements in international arenas to on-the-ground projects, which you said it in the plantation and restoration and mangroves in Indonesia, do need to understand how to connect with international options, policy opportunities that make it more viable, sustainable, probably more easier for you on the ground too. I would like to thank you for being with us and share your experience in that part of the Global Forest Summit. And we wrap up this insight session from your project at Iucn in Indonesia, and I'll give the floor to the next speaker very soon. Thank you. Well, we get to the end of this first session of the 2022 Global Forest Summit, entitled From New York to Glasgow, Keeping Forest on Top of the Agenda Until 2030. And to conclude this session, I'm happy to welcome in the room Dr. Cathy Mckinnon, Emeritus Chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas at Iucn. Cathy, you've been hearing this conversation from the beginning, and I do thank you for having taken good notes of what has been said. What are the main highlights you would like us to remind in moving forward after the Global Forest Summit and this first session?
Thank you. First of all, let me say it's a great pleasure to follow Pak Zulkifli, because I also spent 10 years of my life working on conservation issues in Indonesia, which is one of the great biodiversity countries. I think everybody has reiterated how the world is facing both a biodiversity crisis and a climate change crisis, and how we really need to address them together. And there is some good progress on that now, with collaboration between the various Rio conventions. Glasgow, for instance, emphasized the importance of protecting natural ecosystems as nature-based solutions to climate change. Governments are meeting currently under the auspices of the Convention on Biological Diversity to propose and agree a new global biodiversity framework up until 2030. And there's strong support for protecting and conserving at least 30% of terrestrial, marine, and freshwater ecosystems by 2030. A greater focus on forests will be essential to meeting both of these agendas. We've also heard how forests provide multiple benefits, not only protecting biodiversity, but contributing to climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. Many of these benefits are not taken into account in national accounting. We've accepted them as free services. Forests cover approximately 35% of the world, and yet they store something like 50% of terrestrial carbon. They also sequester and remove some 2.4 billion tons of carbon every year. That's equivalent to 1/3 of all fossil fuel emissions. So this is really significant. Forested watersheds regulate water flow and runoff. They ensure reliable water supplies and are important in mitigating flooding. And coastal forests, like Pak Zulkifli has talked about, are important in protecting coastal communities from storm surges. Many of the world's major cities rely on getting good quality water supplies from forest protected areas. That includes New York, Mumbai, Karachi, Melbourne, among many others. So protected areas, and particularly protected forests, can contribute to water and food security, reduce disaster risk, and of course, we've all seen the benefits of exposure to nature during the recent pandemic for helping to improve our physical and mental health. Forests, and especially protected forests, are cost-effective, green, clean, proven, nature-based solutions to climate change and other global challenges. We've also heard a lot about how we have to establish partnerships and work collectively across governments, the private sector, and local communities. I want to particularly stress the need to work with local communities, especially if we're intending to expand the Global Protected Area Network. We need to recognise the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities and ensure that they get benefits. Many of your speakers, like Masunda and Chris, already covered that topic. I think it's interesting that about a quarter of all land outside Antarctica falls under what we might call indigenous lands. Those indigenous lands contain about 13% of all carbon stored in terrestrial ecosystems and make up about 40% of formerly protected land. So it's significant that these indigenous peoples and local communities are managing those areas, including forests, in a way that's protecting biodiversity. In the Amazon basin, for instance, approximately 26% of the area falls under protected areas, but another 20% are indigenous territories. The way those areas are managed is critical not just for carbon storage and biodiversity, but influences the weather patterns across the whole of South America. So it's really important that we protect those forests. But if we really want to bend the curve for biodiversity and keep global warming increase to less than 2 degrees centigrade, we need to not just increase conservation, we have to stop deforestation, and we have to really have more sustainable management across the rest of the world's forests. Land conversion, deforestation, and degradation is responsible for something like 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That means that we really need to address this issue of ecosystem degradation. We need to make forest restoration a supplement to protection and conservation. I wouldn't even prioritize conservation first. I think we need to do all of this together. But what to restore and where? We need to plant the right trees in the right places, according to the 10 golden rules as amplified by the COP conference. We need to ensure that tree planting programs, habitat restoration, and agroforestry practices are protecting, restoring, and enhancing biodiversity and ecological connectivity. Good examples like the Green Wall in Africa, which benefit local communities, or the new ecosystem restoration concessions and production forests in Indonesia. None of these challenges will be met without major financial resources. It's been estimated that we may need up to $65 billion a year to be mobilized by 2030 to achieve global forest goals of protecting, restoring forests and managing them more sustainably. The funding is important, but even more important is political will. Government's response to the COVID pandemic showed us that when there's urgency, governments can act quickly and decisively when faced with a crisis. They need to muster that same energy and commitment going forward to address the forest crisis. The next decade will shape our planet's future. It's going to be really important that we not only have effective protected and conserved areas, but also that reforestation efforts help to connect and restore the world's forests. We need to move from good words, fine words, strong commitments to effective action on the ground to have a carbon neutral and nature positive future for our planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. That is wonderful. You wrapped up everything in a small nutshell. 5 minutes to talk about this 2 hours policy discussion. I do thank you for wrapping it up. So clearly, one thing you said that is dear to me is that this notion of leadership and political will that brings us to questioning the relationship that I would say humanity does have with nature. This is the philosophical question we will ask ourselves in the next session of this 2022 Global First Summit that will take place at 20 past 12 CET. We will meet you, I do hope, in a minute. I would like to thank all our wonderful speakers and Reforestation teams for making it possible with open diplomacy to host this 2022 Global First Summit in Brussels and online. We will meet ourselves very soon after Kathy's very wise wrap-up after this first session. Thank you very much.